very much. Thanks for staying. It's always a relief. I sometimes wonder when I re-emerge. A totally empty hall. Anyway, thank you for staying. Out of interest, I asked at the beginning how many of you have been to the live show that I do around the UK. And somewhat depressingly, only one person put their hand up. Just out of interest, how many of you listen to the podcast that I do? Oh, wow, thank you. Well, that has cheered me up hugely. Let's end it there. Thank you. Well, so a lot of you, for those of you who haven't listened yet, A, how outrageous, and B, those who have, we're all part of what I call the Rock and Roll Politics Cooperative, where all kinds of people contribute to this podcast in many enlightening ways. So if you haven't subscribed, please do after tonight and be part of something. Now, on more important matters, I did say at the beginning the second half would begin with another prediction. And that will frame some of our reflections in our time together in this second half. So let's begin with a prediction. Now, again, this is not what you hope will happen, but what you predict will happen. How many of you here tonight, and again, I don't want to put pressure on you, but BBC, Sky, ITN, they're all out there. How many of you predict that within a year, 12 months, the Northern Ireland Assembly will be back up and running again? How many, I don't know what you have, but how many of you predict it will be? Okay, and how many of you predict it won't be, please? Right. Was that a majority predicting it would be? It was quite close. We might have to do it again. Do you remember David Frost, the presenter? He used to say whatever anyone did or said, absolutely fascinating. And this was, so it looked very close. How many of you predict it will be within the next year, please? Oh yeah, it's a big, I think, and how many predict it won't be? So a majority, that's really interesting, a majority of you predict it will be. Would one of you explain why you think it will be up and running, please? Those of you who predicted, there was a majority. Yeah, there's a hand up at the back. If you don't mind waiting for the mic, because we all need to hear why you think it will be.
Well, I do A-level politics. I'm one of the young people you've attracted, so I was talking it through with my politics class, and we seem to believe that the DUP think that basically that the way that they've been staying out, that they've managed to force sort of a changing to a previously agreed agreement, the way that they said, oh, the Northern Irish Protocol, that's the final end stop, it cannot be changed, and now that it has, so they might see this as, well, we were right, in a way that there has been reform to this, so in a way, it can be seen that they can gain a stronger position potentially in the next election and may come back.
Right. It is interesting. Just hold the mic a second. For those of you who don't listen to my podcast, just leave actually. One of the people who emails regularly is this guy called Canon Paul Arbuthnot, based in Dublin. And he knows the senior figures in the DUP. In fact, he's one of those who would have come tonight, but he's at Windsor Park. So bear that in mind when you disregard the rest of his views. But actually, Paul says that Geoffrey Donaldson is actually by instinct quite pragmatic compared with some of the others. Would you agree with that? Yes, did you say?
Well,
sorry, I couldn't hear.
I don't honestly know. Pragmatism doesn't really seem to be a thing many people have. Like the Northern Irish politicians don't seem to have a great amount nowadays. It just sort of seems to be go with your gut instinct and then see what happens.
Yeah, it is. It's a really interesting question, by the way, in politics. What is pragmatic? What is expedient? By the way, many other listeners, when Canon Paul Arbuthnot emailed me with this, lots emailed in response from Northern Ireland saying, you must be joking. So it is what is expedient, but thank you. Now, oh yeah, that's great. Could you keep the lights up actually for this bit? Some of you predicted that the assembly would not be up and running. Would one of you explain why, please? Oh yeah, there's a hand up right there where your mic is. Yeah.
I think that Jeffrey Donaldson and the DUP essentially backed themselves into a corner with the TUV and the Loyalist community, so much so that, considering the fact that they've openly come out and said that the Windsor framework doesn't meet the 7 tests,
Yeah.
combined with the fact that Chris Heaton-Harris and Rishi Sunak have said this is it, there's no more negotiations, I wouldn't be surprised if there's a backroom agreement between Downing Street and Brussels to say that neither side is going to even hint that they're willing to talk about this anymore, and therefore it gives no more room. And I think actually Jeffrey Donaldson, to be honest, personally speaking, I think he probably actually would accept the Windsor Agreement, only, or the Windsor Framework, sorry,
Yeah.
only for the fact that people such as like Jamie Bryson and the sort of hardline
He couldn't carry the rest of his party with him.
No, I do believe there would be a revolt from the Loyalist community.
And when you say
background.
he's backed himself into a corner, isn't a corner from which there is, to go back to my first up, words and consequences, is it a corner from which there is no escape for the DUP?
I think there's no escape for Jeffrey Donaldson.
No escape for Donaldson. So,
Apart
yeah.
from a resignation potentially.
Yeah.
That's it.
So he has to do. Anyone else want to explain how they predicted in the way that they did? Are there any other hands up at this point? Okay. No, I can't believe it. All right, okay, that's fine. Remember, when I go order, please raise any points for this evening. But if it's okay with all of you, let's frame our time together with your prediction. So what fascinates me about this discordant dance, in a way, between Brexit, the politics of Northern Ireland, the politics of the Conservative Party, is that the interconnection really was obvious from the beginning. And I remember having a breakfast with the then London-based German ambassador in the autumn of 2015. And David Cameron had become Prime Minister with an overall majority, going ahead with the referendum on Brexit. And Cameron, remember, was out going around trying to renegotiate Britain terms of membership, which he failed totally, misjudged Merkel, misjudged other European leaders. Anyway, over breakfast, the German ambassador, I don't know why I was invited, but I had this great breakfast of scrambled eggs on toast. He had about 14 sausages, being German. Sorry, no, it's German. And the German ambassador said something which stayed with me. And he said this: Britain is the least suited member of the European Union to leave for one reason: Northern Ireland and Ireland. There is no other member with the impossible conundrum. Both Ireland and Britain, the UK, joined on the same day in 1973. The coming together at that point was not reflected on at all. I've looked back, I'm just writing a book on turning points in the UK. And obviously 73 was a turning point. The UK joined Europe, the common market. Nowhere in the reflections of the anti-Europeans or pro-Europeans, including Heath, was the significance that Ireland and the UK joined on the same date. But this German ambassador noted the conundrum of what you do when a part of the area we are in tonight is in the European Union and a part is not. And he said, rightly in my view, you might disagree, there is no straightforward solution to the conundrum. And I've been kind of thinking, I thought about it from that moment onwards. I left his beautiful home in London thinking, yeah, that is a big issue. What happened next is really interesting. During the 2016 referendum, There was the Remain group, as you know, versus the Leave group, which had two different campaigns. One led by Dominic Cummings and the other by Nigel Farage, because surprise, surprise, Farage and Cummings didn't get on well together. Because there was no room for two such egos in one room. But this was interesting. On the Remain side, Blair, Major, and actually one or two other former Prime Ministers said to the Remain campaign, look, we really want to be part of the campaign. What about if all the Prime Ministers hold a big rally arguing for Remain? And the Remain campaign had a heart attack, saying that will guarantee we lose, because there is such cynicism in England specifically about former prime ministers that it would be, they saw it as a threat, not an offer. And so the Remain campaign, the key figures of that campaign, thought, what the hell do we do with every day Blair and Major phone us up and say, what can we do in this campaign? And as you will all know, they came up with an answer. They said, why don't you go to Belfast to warn about the issues to do with leaving and the peace process and Northern Ireland, Britain. And so they did. As you know, Blair and Major, it was the only thing they were allowed to do during the Brexit campaign was to come here and to warn of, to use my favourite word in the podcast, the consequences of leaving. Now, I was very interesting. I was at the BBC, I wasn't on staff at the BBC, but I was in the main sort of BBC headquarters in London when Blair and Major did their events in Belfast. And the view of the BBC in London was that this was pretty peripheral. And it was a kind of lead news story for about 5 minutes in London. I'm sure it was bigger here, but in London, 5 minutes, and it was gone. And they both warned. I can remember seeing the two of them together because it was really interesting for me, because Blair, in the build-up to 1997 in Britain, in Westminster, hated Major, and Major hated Blair. Well, when they were here in Belfast warning of what would happen if Brexit happened, they were as if they were a sort of gay couple, you know, sort of almost holding hands in love with each other with their message. But it played virtually no part in the referendum campaign. And then, as you all know, Brexit happened. Although Northern Ireland voted Remain, the DUP, for reasons that I think, you know, with every respect to any DUP person here, only a psychiatrist would understand, wanted Brexit without thinking through, my favourite word, the consequences. You know, think through consequences, and they would have been, I suspect, in a different place, but they weren't. They supported Brexit. The majority of Northern Ireland supported Remain. And then we move on to the next episode in this weird, discordant dance. Cameron resigned, famously the day after the referendum, walked out at number 10. Apparently his staff offered him about 3 glasses of whiskey before he went out at 8 o'clock in the morning and announced his resignation. And Theresa May came in. And Theresa May was a much more sort of assiduous figure than Cameron, who had this Etonian characteristic of regarding politics partly as a game. She was hard-working, forensic, but for the first 6 months, she didn't really reflect on that German ambassador's reflection. She didn't think about how do we deal with the conundrum of Northern Ireland and the rest of Ireland in different places within the European Union. So she famously said, Brexit means Brexit. which was utterly incomprehensible even to herself. Indeed, I've spoken to the person who framed that phrase, Brexit means Brexit. It was framed by her advisor, Nick Timothy, who kind of was an overwhelming advisor. He kind of told her what to say, basically. And I said to Nick Timothy, Nick, what did Brexit means Brexit mean? And he said, I haven't a bloody clue. But it sounded defiant. It sounded as if we had a mission and a purpose. So off she went, Brexit means Brexit. And then she came across the problem raised by the German ambassador. What do we do when Northern Ireland is part of the UK out of the European Union and the rest of Ireland is in the European Union? And suddenly, because she had a degree of intelligence, she was completely thrown by this question, because there isn't an obvious answer to this very evening when we're all gathered together here. And so off she went. The first thing she did is, well, I'm not quite sure of the answer, so I called a general election. So she called a general election in 2017, saying two things. First of all, vote for me. Sorry, she sounds like Margaret Thatcher. Vote for me because Brexit means Brexit. And she said, vote for me because I am solid and stable. Is it solid and stable? Strong and stable. Strong and stable. And voters didn't. She lost an overall majority. So she came back as Prime Minister, having called that election in 2017. Lost an overall majority. What could she do? She turned to the DUP and immediately became trapped. It's very interesting that the guy at the back there said Jeffrey Donaldson is now trapped. She became trapped in needing the DUP to back whatever she did, because suddenly she found, to her horror, that there was no obvious answer to this question about Northern Ireland and the rest of Ireland. And then there was a period in British politics where everyone went bonkers. And you had, inevitably, when bonkers politics is around, up popped Boris Johnson, who was then Foreign Secretary. Theresa May, by the way, absolutely regrets making Boris Johnson Foreign Secretary. She's not a person for introspective reflection. But if you speak to her and mention Boris Johnson, she just collapses. And there was a period where everyone was saying, what do we do about the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland? And Boris Johnson popped up as Foreign Secretary. So it's very straightforward. You know, we have an Oyster card for the London Underground. We'll have an Oyster card for the border. And then he would disappear for about 6 months. You wouldn't hear from him. Well, he's never been to what you will all know as this astonishingly amorphous border. So one proposition was an Oyster card. Theresa May suddenly realised this was a big problem. And only she did. So at the time, her Brexit secretary was David Davis. Do you remember David Davis? He turned up at his first meeting with the European Union. And there's that wonderful photo of the European Union negotiators with about 58 files, which they had thought through. And David Davis just walked in with a notepad. And he thought, oh, this will throw them, this will do this. And May, to her credit, realised that this issue of the border was huge, without obvious solution. David Davis, he wasn't as flippant as Johnson to say, you know, it was the same as the London Underground, but he thought it was very straightforward. So May said to David Davis, have you ever been to the border? And he said, no, actually I haven't, Theresa, but I know it's very straightforward. Technology will deal with it. In British politics, all the superficial players say technology deals with everything. And she said, this is a classic Theresa May, I'd love to have been there. She said to David Davis, I'm ordering you to go to the border and have a look at it. So David Davis, with his usual swagger, said, yeah, all right, Theresa, I'll go to the border. Then David Davis phoned up about 60 journalists to accompany him to the border. And sure enough, he was taken aback by the scale of the border and how you deal with it. But he chose then, as most people at Westminster do, when faced with, favourite word in the podcast, the consequences. He resigned. Because how else to deal with it? There is no straightforward answer, as everyone in this room knows. And so he, with a swagger, announced very quickly, having visited the border, that he was resigning as Brexit Secretary. That's what they all did when they were faced with the consequences. Look what happened. David Davis resigned. He was replaced, I think, by Dominic Raab, who currently is being investigated for 10,000 accusations of bullying. But Raab was briefly Brexit Secretary until he was faced with this conundrum, at which point he resigned. And then you had Lord Frosty Frost. Now, I pretend to be calm and gentle. It's all an act. I'm livid, angry, and dangerous behind the scenes. And one of the people who I would personally destroy is Lord Frosty Frost. And Frost came along, appointed by Johnson, and basically just kind of ignored the issue of this, really. Well, not wholly, because he was following Johnson. We'll come on to him in a minute. They all resigned. Farage, after the referendum, literally the day after the Brexit referendum, you know, at least the DUP, for all their deep, complicated, contradictory hopes and flaws, kind of stayed in place. Farage, who was basically responsible for that referendum, on the day after, resigned. They all run away. And so you have this situation where one after other of the Brexit secretaries, faced with this problem that the German ambassador to me identified as a conundrum with no solution, they just resign, one after the other. Anyway, Theresa May famously found a solution, which is that Britain stays, the whole of the UK stays in the customs union, thereby avoiding a border anyway. But Johnson and the DUP and the European Reform Group, then led by Steve Baker, and others, thought, right, this is a threat. She has found a solution of sorts to the problem, the impossible problem of the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland by staying in the customs union. So we will destroy her. And that's what they did. And I said at the beginning, I would talk a bit about the changed nature of the Conservative Parliamentary Party. And it is in the context of Westminster, of Brexit and Northern Ireland. They have become insurrection. Maybe until the vote last week, which we talked about in the first half, in that Steve Baker, who is now Northern Ireland Minister, until his recent metamorphosis, where he now, say, adores the Windsor framework, thinks it's Hamlet, Macbeth combined. Steve Baker is this evangelical Christian who I think used to go home each night and prayed and said, "Dear God, please give me the power to bring down another Conservative Prime Minister." Because one after another, with evangelical passion, he brought them down. Until very recently, when he's gone through some sort of curious, weird metamorphosis. I don't know if any of you saw the footage from the Conservative Party conference last October, where Steve Baker declared that he felt really bad about condemning those who took the knee. And the ERG group got very hot under the collar. If you take the knee, you are a revolutionary communist at the very best. And Steve Baker suddenly said, I think I've been wrong about all of this. And he stood, he went down and kneeled and took the knee in front of a load of ERG fanatics, all aged about 95. There he was taking the knee, they all fainted, hospitals were full of ERG members. We've just seen Steve Baker take the knee, I think we are having a heart attack. He went through a weird metamorphosis to this very day, actually. I'm trying to get hold of him to interview him because his endorsement of the Windsor framework has split his own creation, the ERG. To the point, I'm told, where last week after the vote in the Commons on the Windsor framework, he looked on his WhatsApp to text the ERG group, and he, Steve Baker, had been removed from the WhatsApp. He thought, oh my God, they've killed me. And so strange things are going on. But at that point, May had a solution, which was to stay in the customs union. Johnson saw his opportunity. Now, Johnson was never sure whether he would be a Remainer or a Brexiteer. He had no sense, really, of this question raised to me by the German ambassador. But he saw an opportunity. So he killed off Theresa May, got elected on the basis that Brexit would be done very quickly. But how? How? No deal would have been a catastrophe economically, and Johnson knew that, and was politically impossible. So what he did was weird. He proposed the border between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK, which was what the EU proposed originally to do. So it was back to the original deal that the DUP got very worked up about when Theresa May contemplated signing up to it. He signed up to it, proclaimed it to be the greatest triumph of negotiation ever. They were terrified of us. And put this border between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. He then lied, to be honest, about the consequences, to use that word again. We've talked about it already, that famous video of him with Belfast business leaders saying, if there's any additional paperwork, phone me personally, without leaving his number with them. There was an inevitability about what followed. And once again, the dance is so interesting because the DUP that Theresa May had worked so hard to woo, turned against Theresa May's deal, turned in the end against Sunak's attempt to make sense of the Northern Ireland Protocol. So where are they? Well, what is their answer to the impossible question? And Johnson then proclaimed Brexit was done. And by the way, in the December 2019 election, even the metaphors didn't quite work because he said, we've got an oven-ready deal. Put it in the microwave. Perfect. Well, if it's oven-ready, you don't put it in a microwave. I mean, it's already cooked. And in a way, it revealed his own awareness that it wasn't really done. So Johnson returns, get Brexit done. And in January 2020, we all leave. Everyone in this room and all the rest of us leave, but not really, because the answer to this question has not been fully resolved. And Johnson and Lord Frosty Frost go around saying at first, for a few weeks, triumph, Lord, get me Frosty, brilliant, protocol, fantastic. And then they realised there would be checks, inevitably. Goods coming here and going, in some cases, to the single market. So suddenly this deal that they had negotiated became a problem. And they disowned the deal that they had negotiated. But they, Johnson and Lord Frosty Frost, thought that the answer to the conundrum was just to be tough on the EU, threaten to break international law and pretend there is no border, even though it was they who proposed a border. And then Johnson falls because of Partygate, which we talked about in the first half, and other things. He lied about all kinds of things. And Sunak comes in. And Sunak, with his Goldman Sachs mentality, sees an opportunity for a bit of detailed work with the EU, with some agencies here in Belfast, to do the famous Windsor framework. But Johnson, who negotiated the original deal that he himself deemed to be appalling, then disowned the Windsor framework. He probably still wants an oyster card, as a solution to it. So what has really happened in this weird Tory party, which used to be famous for being loyal to its leaders? That was what drove it. And to some extent, that's what drove Ulster unionism, though not wholly. I was talking at the interval with David, who's here, who has met Enoch Powell. And of course, Enoch Powell joined the Ulster Unionists after he left the Tory party in 1974. He resigned in February 74 because he hated Heath, who was the Tory leader at the time. And by October 74 was here in Belfast as an Ulster Unionist. Enoch Powell's a sort of complicated figure. In 1974, he urged his followers to vote Labour because of Europe. And so you can see this continuing dance about Europe, politics, Westminster, Northern Ireland, Ireland. And I suspect the issues which we've explored together tonight are far, far from resolved. And now, ladies and gentlemen, order, order, order. My name is John Burker. I'm available for after-dinner speeches at £20,000 an hour. Order. This is the time where we can have a wider discussion. So it's called question time. We haven't got very long. So who would like to raise anything? Questions, points from our time together?
Sorry, I have one question.
Yeah.
Tell me where...
Can you just wait for the mic?
Absolutely.
Here it comes.
Very simple question. Where will Dominique be speaking? Will she attend any of your meetings?
Sorry, who?
Your French correspondent, Dominique.
Oh, Dominique. Oh, thank you for raising it. Thank you for listening to the point. On the podcast, for those of you who haven't listened until tonight, there's a French correspondent, isn't there, called Dominica?
Yep.
Who I've never met, but I imagine to be close to Bridget Bardot, age 25.
Yeah.
Do you agree?
I do.
And she writes in every week, and it's really interesting. And I think you would agree, exposes the sort of parochialism of all of us lot, because she tells us how it is seen in France, how we, all of us here tonight, are seen in France. So, actually, I've just recorded a podcast today at Stansted Airport because the flight was delayed by hours. And she, Dominica, has written in saying she's so pro-French, isn't she, and anti-British, anti-all of us. And she's written in saying, how dare Radio 4 lead with the strikes in France when virtually every single sector that is causing problems in France is on strike in the UK. And that's a very Dominica contribution to the podcast. And yeah, I feel I know her extremely well. I think you feel you know her extremely well. But I'm going to email her afterwards tonight and say, we're all in love with Dominica. Yeah, she is amazing. And you kind of, when you do these podcasts, which can go anywhere, I'm sure some of you do podcasts, it's really interesting because you become so aware of the it's parochialism. You see, so, I'm sure some of you think, oh God, he's too much about Westminster, but I wouldn't be arrogant enough to talk too much about Northern Ireland because you're more experienced about it than me. But God, are we all so parochial when there are all these models out there in France and Germany, and there's so much we can learn from other European countries, but partly via the DUP we've left all of that behind, you know. Yeah, thank you, brilliant. Dominique will be thrilled. Yeah, the mic's coming at the back there and then further back. How long have we got? I don't know what time I've got away with this, but.
Thank you so much. I've just thoroughly enjoyed this evening, but the question I wanted to ask you, which is very much from a Westminster perspective, is in terms of the titles that have been apportioned to roles recently. I'd love your view on how you feel about Brexit opportunities versus levelling up. Which is more nebulous than the other?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. Language in politics. Brexit opportunities versus levelling up. It's another example which I was trying to explore in the first half, but you've given actually two much better examples than anything I deployed in the first half. Jacob Rees-Mogg, you know who I'm talking about? He was briefly, for about 5 minutes, Secretary of State for Brexit opportunities.
No.
And the only Brexit opportunity, I don't think he found any Brexit opportunity. He, at one point, asked the readers of the Sun newspaper to list their Brexit opportunities. And he did a media blitz saying, oh, it was marvellous for the Sun to define Brexit opportunities, what they saw as the opportunity. And I don't know what happened to that campaign even, because by the time he launched it, he had gone, like all the other Brexit secretaries. Jacob Rees-Mogg is now a presenter on, do you get GB News here? Well, it's unbelievable. At 7 o'clock you get Nigel Farage, and at 8 o'clock for balance you get Jacob Rees-Mogg. And it is the most surreal experience wherever you stand in politics. So Farage at 7, and Farage's appearance is based on, he used to do a show on, you know that the London-based station, LBC, which I think do you get it here? Yeah. And Farage used to do this thing from 7 till 8 on LBC. And this was at the height of his powers. And Farage is a bit like Johnson, fearful of scrutiny. And I used to listen to his programme with a sort of horrified fascination. It was a phone-in. And this is the toughest it got. You know, Farage would say, hello, it's Nigel Farage, 7 o'clock, welcome to LBC. And joining me now, oh yeah, with the first call of the night, Bill from Basildon. And so, hello, Bill. Hello, Nigel, how are you? I'm fine, Bill. What's your point? Bill, this whole bloody country is falling off the cliff's edge. Only one person can save it, Nigel. Oh, who's that, Bill? You, Nigel. Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, and that was the level of scrutiny. And GB News thought, let's get Farage. So Farage is on at 7. You get the same sort of thing. Welcome to GB News. Brexit could have been so good, but we've been betrayed by the Brexiteers. But if you follow me, Brexit. And then at 8 o'clock, you thought, oh, maybe there'll be a change of tone. Hello, welcome, I am Jacob Rees. It's like watching television about 1848. There he is, Rees-Mogg. How did Boris do today in front of the Privileges Select Committee? I'm joined by Boris's sister, Rachel Johnson, my sister, someone Rees-Mogg, and I'm delighted also to welcome Anne Whittaker. And these three maniacs all agreed it was a total triumph for Boris Johnson. And Rees-Mogg, if I could, I rather agree with you. Boris did extremely well in front of him. And then, then at 9 o'clock there's another maniac. It is incredible that these figures are allowed to dominate in that way. But have I gone on a detour? What was the original question? Sorry.
It was about the difference between, Which was more nebulous, levelling up or
Oh
Brexit
yeah.
opportunities?
So we've done Brexit opportunity. Levelling up is really interesting because let's explore those two words. They sound magical, really. That every area. Think of the poorer parts of Northern Ireland. Oh, we can level up. Now it's really interesting because under New Labour, they were really scared of using the word redistribution because it implied accurately that the only way you could push the poorer areas up was to redistribute. And they were scared of saying we're going to take money away from wealthy people and wealthy areas. Levelling up doesn't imply that. It's just all by magic that you can level up in parts of Northern Ireland that are poor, parts of England that are poor. But of course it costs money. Gove, who is Secretary of State for Levelling Up when he's not at a disco in Aberdeen, it's really interesting. Gove appointed to help him with his Levelling Up white paper a guy who was on the Bank of England, a very interesting economist called Andy Haldane. And Andy Haldane, before he became involved with Gove, was talking to Keir Starmer about levelling up, and with the journalist Will Hutton. And they all agreed that to level up in Northern Ireland, in parts of England, Scotland, Wales, would cost a lot of money. Better transport, better training, and all the rest of it. And Gove sort of agreed with them. And this was when Rishi Sunak was Chancellor. And Gove said, well, look, we're doing this levelling up white paper, we'll need more money. And Sunak said no. And so levelling up is a term without a detailed cause. And you're absolutely right to highlight it. Language, Brexit opportunities, levelling up. What does it really mean?
Nothing.
And there are other terms, I think you would agree, modernisation is a popular term. What does it mean to modernise and so on? So thank you. It's a brilliant example of words and language not meaning very much. I think we've got time for one more, so why don't we go to the front here? Is there a mic?
Thank you. Great talk. Do you agree with Anthony Seldon that the job of Prime Minister is an impossible job? And if so, why?
Yeah. Do I agree with Anthony Seldon, who is a chronicler of Prime Ministers? To be honest, I'm a chronicler of Prime Ministers, and if it was a choice between me and Anthony Seldon, I'd recommend me. No. But Seldon has described it as an impossible job. And one of the things that I think, I like exploring live with audiences, I mean, you've been an unusually brilliant audience, but is exactly that. I think it is close to being an impossible. Do you agree? I mean, the dilemmas of a leader are complex, deep, and interesting. And what we in the media fail to do, I think, I don't know whether you agree, is to sort of recognise and analyse the complexity. Because when you do, it becomes more interesting for readers, listeners, viewers. It humanises politicians. And you then kind of think, it's like a thriller. How do they get through this? I'll give you one example which fits into what we've been discussing this evening. Sunak has to face the nightmare of Johnson's resignation honours list, which will be a scandal. He could block it, and if he blocked it, he would get a lot of credit as moving on from the Johnson era. He would also be slaughtered by Paul Dacre, the editor of the Daily Mail, who will be honoured by Johnson. He will be slaughtered by Johnson's father, who will be honoured, and many others. So what does he do? This is just one example of a dilemma. And I remember seeing Blair, who, for all his talk about, be bold, at our best, at our boldest, New Labour, bold. It's my impression of Tony Blair. I saw him in the autumn of 1997 for a coffee in Number 10. He was about 40 points ahead in the polls. The Tory leader was William Hague, who then was deeply unpopular. He tried to be popular by going to Notting Hill Carnival wearing a baseball cap, but he looked absurd, and it didn't work. And yet, when I saw Blair, I think, you've got to watch William, right? He could be quite dangerous. And Blair was terrified. And he said, look, you know, what I'm learning in this job is that every hour, every question is, do I cut my throat or slit my wrist? You know, it's dilemmas everywhere. And so I think, although Anthony Seldon is a kind of shallow chronicle of Prime Minister, I think he is right that it's close to being an impossible job. And in a way, what we have been exploring in our time together, I think, highlights that. I still don't see the answer to Brexit, Northern Ireland, the single market going to Ireland, and the Windsor framework is the latest attempt to address an impossible problem. But I think you would also agree that just spending time together, I think we've cracked everything, haven't we? We've made sense of the complexities of Westminster politics, Northern Ireland politics, Brexit, Europe, and we probably need another drink. But you have all been brilliant tonight. So thank you so much for coming for what I think is the last event of this festival. So you've been brilliant. Thank you very much. Let's keep it up. Thank you.